Picture a world where dragons coil around the edges of the known earth, where oceans fade into blank spaces labeled "Here be monsters," and distant lands shimmer with cities of gold. This wasn't just fantasy, it was reality on the pages of medieval maps, where cartographers and storytellers wove geography and myth into a single tapestry. These maps didn't just chart coastlines and trade routes, they were battlegrounds for rival visions of the world, where every stroke of the pen could reshape reality itself. Behind these creations stood rival mapmakers and mythmakers, locked in a silent struggle to define what was possible, what was true, and what was pure imagination. Their clashes didn't just fill parchment, they shaped how entire generations saw their place in the cosmos. Think about the power of that rivalry. On one side, the mapmakers, armed with compasses and the scraps of knowledge gathered from explorers. Their goal, to pin down the world, to tame its mysteries with grids and coordinates. On the other, the Mythmakers, artists, poets, and chroniclers who painted the unknown with legends of saints, sea serpents, and kingdoms beyond the sunrise. Their weapons weren't measurements but stories, and their battles played out in the margins of maps, where sea monsters lurked and paradise waited just beyond the horizon. These weren't just artistic choices, they were declarations of belief. Every time a mapmaker left a continent blank, a mythmaker rushed to fill it with wonders. And every time a mythmaker spun a tale, a mapmaker raced to prove it or debunk it. So how did these rivalries shape the worlds we still imagine today? Why do fantasy maps feel so familiar, so real, even when they're dotted with elven cities and cursed mountains? The answer lies in those medieval workshops and scriptoriums, where the lines between fact and fiction blurred into something far more powerful, a shared dream of the unknown. This video is a journey into that dream through crumbling atlases, lost legends, and the fierce competition that turned maps into mirrors of human ambition. We'll uncover how a handful of ink-stained rivals didn't just draw coastlines, they drew the boundaries of our collective imagination, and by the end, you'll never look at a map or a myth the same way again. The story begins in dimly lit scriptoriums, where monks hunched over calfskin parchment, their quills scratching out the edges of the known world. These weren't just maps, they were acts of devotion, crafted by hands that believed geography and faith were woven together. Take the famous Mapamundi, created in the 13th century. At first glance, it looks like a whimsical collage of beasts and biblical scenes, but to its makers, it was a sacred diagram, a snapshot of God's creation, with Jerusalem at its heart and time itself spiraling outward toward the apocalypse. This wasn't about precision, it was about meaning. Every inked monster in the ocean, every golden city in the east, whispered a truth deeper than coordinates, that the world was a story and they were its scribes. But the monks weren't working in a vacuum. Travelers' tales trickled back from the edges of empire merchants speaking of deserts where the sand burned like embers, sailors describing islands where the trees bore wool instead of fruit. With no way to verify these claims, mapmakers faced a dilemma: leave the unknown blank or fill it with the only tools they had, faith and folklore. Some chose restraint, sketching coastlines with cautious gaps. Others embraced the poetic, like the Catalan Atlas of 1375, where the Sahara bloomed with a king seated atop a mountain of gold, his scepter pointing to a river of diamonds. These weren't lies, they were hypotheses in dazzling ink. After all, if the Bible spoke of the Garden of Eden, why couldn't it lie beyond the Nile? If ancient texts mentioned the fountain of youth, who's to say it wasn't tucked between the trade winds? And then there were the rivals like the meticulous Arab geographer Al-Idrisi, whose maps for the Norman King Roger Roman II scraped away myth to chart trade routes and mountain passes with startling accuracy. His work clashed directly with the European tradition, where dragons still lurked in the margins. This tension between the scholars who sought to measure the world and the storytellers who sought to marvel at it fueled centuries of debate. When Marco Polo returned from Cathay with descriptions of paper money and cities paved with marble, some called him a liar, others rushed to redraw their maps, eager to absorb this new reality. The lines between fact and fiction weren't just blurry, they were battlegrounds where every stroke of the pen was a wager on what the world could be. What's astonishing isn't how often they got it wrong, but how fiercely they tried to get it right. These maps were living things, evolving with every ship that returned from the horizon. A blank space wasn't an admission of ignorance, it was an invitation. And those sea serpents in the margins, they weren't just decoration. They were placeholders for all the wonders yet to be discovered. A reminder that the world was always wider, stranger, and more wondrous than the page could hold. While the mapmakers measured, the mythmakers dreamed, and nowhere is that clash more vivid than on the Herford Mapamundi, where biblical visions and travelers' tall tales collide. This sprawling medieval map, drawn on a single sheet of calfskin, isn't just a guide to the world, it's a theater of the imagination. Jerusalem sits at the center, yes, but venture toward the edges, and the map erupts with dog-headed men, fire-breathing salamanders, and a tribe of giants sleeping beneath the Caucasus Mountains. These weren't doodles in the margins, they were arguments. Every monster, every fabled city was a declaration that the unknown wasn't empty, it was alive with possibility. Take the legend of Prester John, the mythical Christian king said to rule a paradise beyond the Islamic world. For centuries, his kingdom appeared on maps somewhere in the east, sometimes near India, sometimes in Ethiopia, always just out of reach. Why? Because his story wasn't just a fable, it was a compass needle for European ambitions. If a Christian empire thrived in the heart of the unknown, then the world wasn't just vast, it was waiting to be reclaimed. Mapmakers might grumble about accuracy, but the mythmakers knew a map without hope was just ink on parchment. And then there were the sea monsters. On the Carta Marina of 1539, the oceans writhed with creatures so elaborate they could be characters in their own epic. A whale with the face of a scowling old man, a serpent coiled around a ship like a noose. These weren't warnings to sailors, they were reflections of the era's deepest fears. The ocean wasn't just deep, it was hungry. Every blank space on a map became a canvas for humanity's anxieties and desires. When explorers like Columbus set sail, they weren't just chasing trade winds, they were chasing the echoes of these stories, half expecting to find the gates of paradise or the lair of the kraken. Yet the mythmaker's greatest trick wasn't filling the blanks, it was making the world feel knowable. A dragon on a map might be fiction, but it gave shape to the void. A city of gold might not exist, but it gave explorers a destination. In an age when the world's edges were still soft, these stories didn't distort reality, they defined it. Long after the monsters faded from maps, their legacy lingered. Today's fantasy maps, with their haunted forests and lost citadels, are heirs to that tradition. The medieval mythmakers taught us that a map isn't just a tool, it's a story, and every story needs a little magic. Centuries before medieval monks sketched their dragons and golden cities, a man in Alexandria laid the foundations of scientific cartography. Claudius Ptolemy, working in the 2nd century, didn't just draw maps, he calculated them. His Geographia was a revolution. a grid of latitudes and longitudes, precise coordinates for thousands of locations, and a method to project the spherical Earth onto flat parchment. This wasn't storytelling, it was mathematics. Ptolemy's world had no room for dog-headed men or fountains of youth, only cold, clear data. His maps were tools designed to guide travelers, not to stir souls. But when his work resurfaced in medieval Europe, it landed like a meteor in a world that had long since moved on. By then, maps weren't just guides, they were sermons. The scholars who rediscovered Ptolemy's texts faced a dilemma: embrace his precision or defend their sacred geography. Some, like the 15th century humanist Cardinal Bessarion, saw Ptolemy as a lifeline to lost knowledge, a way to strip away centuries of myth. Others clung to tradition, insisting that Jerusalem's rightful place was at the center of the world, not some arbitrary intersection of grid lines. The clash wasn't just about accuracy, it was about authority. Who got to define reality, the ancient mathematician with his star charts or the church with its divine vision? The tension played out in fascinating ways. Take the famous Fra Mauro map of 1450. At first glance, it seems like a surrender to Ptolemy, a meticulous rendering of coastlines and rivers. But look closer, and the old world still whispers through. The Garden of Eden lingers in the margins, tucked discreetly beyond the Indian Ocean. The Atlantic swirls with ships and sea creatures, half navigation chart, half illuminated manuscript. Fra Mauro wasn't rejecting Ptolemy. He was trying to reconcile him with a universe that still hummed with miracles. Meanwhile, in the courts of Renaissance princes, Ptolemy's maps became status symbols, proof that their owners stood at the cutting edge of knowledge. But even here, the mythmakers pushed back. When Columbus set sail in 1492, he carried maps annotated with Ptolemy's coordinates, alongside notes scribbled in the margins about the gold-rich kingdom of Antilia, a phantom island straight out of legend. The irony, Ptolemy's own errors, like underestimating the Earth's size, may have emboldened Columbus to sail west. Even the most scientific maps couldn't escape the pull of human longing. In the end, the debate wasn't settled by scholars or priests, but by explorers. As Magellan's ships circled the globe and Mercator refined his projection, the balance tipped. Maps became increasingly mathematical, their blank spaces filled not with monsters but with coastlines yet to be surveyed. Yet something undeniably human faded from them too. The medieval mapmakers had understood. A world without wonder is just a collection of lines. Today, when we trace our fingers over GPS screens, we might have Ptolemy's precision, but we've lost a little of that magic that made the unknown feel alive. To understand the tension between sacred and secular maps, look no further than Isidore of Seville's 7th century masterpiece, the Etymologies. This encyclopedic work didn't just describe the world, it baptized it. Isidore's maps were less about navigation and more about meditation, arranging continents into a perfect T-shape with Asia atop the crossbar, Europe and Africa below, and Jerusalem as the pivot point. This wasn't cartography, it was theology in ink. The earth became a divine blueprint, every mountain and river a stanza in a hymn written by God. For centuries, this vision held sway in monasteries across Europe, where maps served as spiritual exercises, reminding viewers that geography was just another path to salvation. But not everyone was content to see the world through stained glass. By the 12th century, scholars in cities like Toledo and Cordoba were poring over rediscovered Greek and Arabic texts, hungry for a different kind of truth. Figures like Dorado of Cremona, translating Ptolemy's Geographia from Arabic into Latin, began to ask uncomfortable questions. What if the Earth wasn't a symbolic canvas but a measurable object? What if Jerusalem wasn't the geometric center, just another city on a spinning sphere? these weren't just academic quibbles, they were direct challenges to the church's authority. A map that prioritized trade winds over biblical events didn't just guide sailors, it undermined the very idea of a universe designed around human drama. The backlash was predictable. When the monk Ranulph Higden created his Polychronicon in the 14th century, he carefully balanced the new secular knowledge with older sacred traditions. His world map included recent discoveries like the Canary Islands, but it also squeezed the Garden of Eden into the Far East, a tiny paradise hovering just beyond India. This wasn't ignorance, it was diplomacy. Even as explorers brought back reports of distant lands, many mapmakers still felt compelled to leave room for miracles, lest they be accused of heresy. Yet the tide was turning. By the 15th century, princes and merchants demanded maps that could guide ships, not souls. The Medici family commissioned portolan charts, practical, unadorned navigational tools where coastlines were drawn with ruthless precision, and monsters were replaced with compass roses. For the first time, maps were becoming commodities, valued for their utility rather than their piety. The church fought back, censoring works that strayed too far from orthodoxy, but the genie was out of the inkhorn. When Martin Behaim crafted his famous Erdapfel globe in 1492, he included one telling detail: the Atlantic Ocean, vast and empty, with no room for St. Brendan's Island or other pious fictions. The age of the sacred map was fading, and the world was becoming quite literally a colder, lonelier place. What's fascinating isn't just that these worldviews clashed, but how deeply their conflict shaped the maps we still use today. The grid lines of modern cartography owe everything to those secular scholars who insisted the Earth could be measured. But the lingering allure of fantasy maps, the ones we lose ourselves in when reading Tolkien or playing Dungeons and Dragons, that's the echo of Isidore's sacred geography. We may no longer believe dragons lurk off the coast of Scandinavia, but part of us still wishes they did. The great map-making rivalry didn't just chart territory, it mapped the human heart, forever torn between the need to know and the desire to believe. Those sea serpents coiled around ships weren't just decorative flourishes, they were medieval Europe's way of screaming into the void. Picture a 15th century sailor unrolling a chart, his finger tracing the coast of Norway until it snagged on the inked tentacles of a kraken. That creature wasn't fantasy, it was a coded message. The unknown wasn't merely empty, it was hostile, and every monster on these maps served as both warning and confession. We fear what we don't understand, and these cartographers poured those fears onto parchment with quill and colored ink. Take the Cynos Folly, those dog-headed men lurking at the edges of so many medieval maps. To modern eyes, they're absurd, but to a monk in a scriptorium, they embodied a profound theological dilemma. If these creatures existed, did they have souls? Could they be baptized? Their presence on maps wasn't just exoticism, it was a boundary marker for civilization itself. Beyond here, the rules changed. Even the more scientific Arab geographers like Al-Idrisi included them, though often with skeptical footnotes. This tension between reporting travelers' tales and maintaining scholarly rigor turned every mythical creature into a battleground. Some mapmakers scrawled "Hic sunt dracones," "Here be dragons," as a disclaimer, while others, like the Venetian Fra Mauro, quietly omitted them, letting blank spaces speak for themselves. The monsters also reflected very real dangers. The sea swine on Olaus Magnus's 1539 Carta Marina, a bristled beast with reptilian eyes, likely distilled generations of sailors' encounters with rogue waves or walruses' hazards exaggerated into mythology through retelling. And when cartographers placed giants like the Patagonian Cap d'Oie on southern continents, They weren't just spinning yarns, they were preparing explorers for the other. These creatures served the same purpose as today's. Here be bandits' highway signs, cautionary tales wrapped in spectacle. Yet for every mapmaker who used monsters to terrify, another deployed them to entice. The dragon guarding an island might warn sailors away, or hint at untapped riches, since medieval lore often linked serpents to hoarded gold. This duality fueled bitter rivalries. The German scholar Sebastian Münster mocked his peers in 1544 for stuffing their maps with trifles, while his rival, the French cosmographer André Thevet, proudly populated his maps with mermen, claiming they'd been verified by trustworthy Indians. Behind these arguments lay a deeper question. Was a map's job to document reality or to ignite ambition? The slow disappearance of these creatures tells its own story. By the 1600s, as navigational charts became tools of empire, sea monsters shrank into decorative cartouches, then vanished entirely, but their legacy lingers. Today's fantasy maps, studded with dragons and lost cities, owe everything to those medieval inkblots of fear and wonder. Those mapmakers understood something we've forgotten, that every blank space on a map isn't just unknown territory, it's a mirror, reflecting back whatever we most dread or desire to find. The Herford Mapamundi isn't just a map, it's a cathedral of the imagination, where geography and theology collide in one sprawling masterpiece. Created around 1300, this massive calfskin parchment stretches over 5 feet tall, a breathtaking fusion of biblical narrative, classical myth, and the faint whispers of real-world exploration. At its heart sits Jerusalem, not as a city but as the axis mundi, the literal center of the universe where Christ's crucifixion bridges heaven and earth. Radiating outward, the map unfolds like a medieval Wikipedia. Noah's Ark rests in Armenia, the Tower of Babel rises in Babylon, and the Red Sea parts in a vivid splash of pigment. But venture toward the edges, and the familiar gives way to the fantastical. Here, the world bristles with dog-headed cannibals, one-eyed giants, and a tribe of people who shade themselves with their own enormous feet. This wasn't carelessness, it was cosmology. Every bizarre detail served a purpose, stitching together a vision of creation where the miraculous was just another feature of the landscape. What makes the Mapamundi so fascinating isn't just its content, but its contradictions. The map includes startlingly accurate details like the zigzag course of the Nile, alongside pure myth. The Garden of Eden perches at the top, not as a symbolic flourish but as a real place, complete with Adam, Eve, and a serpent coiled around the tree of knowledge. Nearby, Alexander the Great's legendary gates imprison the unclean tribes of Gog and Magog, awaiting the apocalypse. These elements weren't random, they were carefully curated to teach as much as to guide. Pilgrims who couldn't read Latin could still read the map, tracing salvation history from creation to redemption. It was theology. You could walk through a virtual reality tour of a universe where every mountain and monster had divine meaning. Yet even in its own time, the Mapamundi had critics. Scholars like Roger Bacon grumbled about its lack of practical utility, arguing that a map should help travelers, not sermonize. Arab geographers, whose works were far more precise, dismissed it as childish fantasy, but these critiques missed the point. The map's creators weren't trying to compete with portolan charts, they were building something grander, a visual encyclopedia of Christian knowledge. When it showed the Earth as a perfect circle, it wasn't ignorance but intentional symbolism, the world as God's flawless creation. When it placed the mythical gold-digging ants of Herodotus near India, it wasn't credulity but a nod to classical authority, weaving pagan lore into a Christian framework. The map's true genius lies in its layers. Scrape away the monsters and you'll find real trade routes, likely gleaned from merchants' accounts. Ignore the biblical scenes and there's a rough approximation of continental shapes. Even the infamous "here be dragons" phrase, often misattributed to the Mapamundi, isn't actually present. Instead, the map's margins simply bristle with wonders, leaving viewers to decide what was literal and what was allegory. This ambiguity was its superpower. A sailor might scoff at the giant foot people but still use the map's coastal outlines. A monk might meditate on Eden's location while ignoring the precise latitude of Paris. Today, the Mapamundi feels like a time capsule of a lost worldview, one where the boundaries between fact and faith were porous. Modern maps might be more accurate, but they've lost something too, the sense that geography could be a spiritual journey. The Hereford map's legacy lingers in our love for fantasy cartography, where places like Middle-earth or Westeros feel real not because they're meticulously surveyed, but because they're layered with stories. The Mapamundi's creators understood that the most powerful maps aren't just tools, they're invitations to wonder, and 6 centuries later, we're still accepting that invitation. While European monks sketched dragons in the margins of their maps, a revolution in precision was unfolding under the domes of Baghdad and Cordoba. The Islamic Golden Age didn't just preserve ancient Greek geography, it transformed it, merging Ptolemy's grids with first-hand accounts from merchants, pilgrims, and astronomers. At the heart of this movement stood Muhammad al-Idrisi, a 12th century scholar whose work for King Roger Roman II of Sicily would redefine cartography. His Tabula Rogeriana wasn't just a map, it was a scientific marvel, compiling 70 geographers' reports into a silver-plated masterpiece that rotated on its axis, showing the world as a sphere centuries before Columbus sailed. Al-Idrisi's approach was radical for its time. Instead of filling blank spaces with monsters, he left them blank, a humble admission of the unknown. His maps featured meticulously measured distances between cities, accurate river courses, and even climate zones based on astrological calculations. But what truly set his work apart was its reliance on eyewitness testimony. Arab traders who'd crossed the Sahara, Jewish merchants who'd sailed to India, even Viking captives describing the frozen north, all were cross-examined by al-Idrisi's team. The result, a map where Scandinavia's jagged coastline emerged with startling clarity, where the sources of the Nile were plotted with near-scientific precision, and where the Indian Ocean opened into a vast expanse instead of being boxed in by legend. This rigor created an intellectual clash with European cartography. While the Hereford Mapamundi placed Jerusalem at the center of a flat, symbolic world, al-Idrisi's maps treated the Earth as a measurable object. His work didn't ignore wonder, it just relocated it. The Isle of the Blessed, a mythical paradise, appeared on his maps but tucked discreetly in the Atlantic, labeled as unverified. Even his sea monsters were restrained. Where European maps showed krakens dragging ships underwater, al-Idrisi's oceans bore cautious notes about large fish that may capsize vessels. The influence of these Arab cartographers seeped into Europe through unlikely channels. When crusaders looted libraries in Antioch or Tripoli, they often carried back Arabic manuscripts as trophies only for scholars to realize their value. By the 13th century, Toledo had become a translation hub where Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars worked side by side, rendering Arabic texts into Latin. Ptolemy's Geographia, lost to Europe for centuries, re-entered circulation through these Arabic translations, now annotated with updates from Baghdad's astronomers. The irony was palpable. The very maps that would fuel Europe's age of exploration were refined by the cultures its armies had fought. Yet the rivalry wasn't one-sided. Arab geographers, for all their precision, still wrestled with tradition. Al-Biruni, an 11th century polymath, calculated the Earth's circumference with astonishing accuracy, yet his maps still included the mythical barrier of Gog and Magog, a nod to Quranic prophecy. Even Al-Idrisi, the champion of empiricism, couldn't resist marking Alexander the Great's legendary wall on his maps, though he added a skeptical footnote. This tension between faith and measurement mirrored Europe's own struggles, proving that no culture had a monopoly on the tug of war between myth and math. The legacy of this cross-pollination is etched into modern maps. The astrolabe perfected by Arab astronomers became the GPS of the medieval world, allowing sailors to navigate by the stars. The concept of latitude and longitude, refined in observatories from Damascus to Seville, underpins every digital map we use today. And perhaps most tellingly, when European explorers like Vasco da Gama set sail, they carried maps heavily indebted to Arab cartography, often with the original Arabic place names still legible beneath the Latin annotations. The lines on those parchments weren't just routes, they were the ghostly fingerprints of a rivalry that shaped how we see the world, not as a canvas for monsters, but as a puzzle waiting to be solved. In 1957, a bombshell dropped in the world of cartography. A tattered parchment known as the Vineland map surfaced, allegedly proving that Norse explorers had charted North America centuries before Columbus. Its faded ink traced coastlines eerily similar to Newfoundland, with a label declaring Vineland Insula, the land of wild grapes described in Viking sagas. If genuine, this map would rewrite history, placing medieval Europe a staggering 500 years ahead of its time in the race to the New World. But almost immediately, suspicions flared. The parchment lacked the usual wear of medieval documents. Its ink seemed suspiciously modern, and its sudden appearance, just as the Cold War fueled nationalist rivalries over exploration history, felt too convenient. What followed wasn't just academic debate, it was a forensic showdown where scientists, historians, and even CIA ink analysts dueled over every pen stroke. The case for the map's authenticity hinged on tantalizing details. Its depiction of Greenland matched Norse sailing routes, and the handwriting bore similarities to 15th century monastic scripts. Supporters argued that its creator might have accessed lost Viking charts, perhaps via the Danish court where Norse exploration records were kept. Even the map's errors seemed telling, like its skewed rendering of Iceland, suggesting a cartographer working from second-hand accounts rather than copying a flawless source. These nuances made it feel like a genuine artifact of its time, warts and all. But the skeptics struck back with hard science. In 2002, a team at University College London analyzed the ink and found traces of anatase, a titanium compound not used in medieval pigments. Then came the parchment's carbon dating. While the calfskin was indeed medieval, experts noted it could have been scraped clean and reused, a common practice for forgers. Most damning, the map's wormholes didn't align with its supposed companion volume, a medieval travel manuscript. It was as if someone had punched holes in the wrong places while trying to stage authenticity. Beyond the forensics, the Vineland map exposed a deeper tension in cartographic history, the seductive power of what if. For decades, the map's supporters included prestigious institutions like Yale University, which acquired it in 1965. Why? Because the idea was irresistible, that a lone medieval monk might have held knowledge lost to the ages, a secret thread connecting Europe to America long before empires raced west. The map became a Rorschach test. Nationalists saw proof of Nordic primacy, academics glimpsed a missing link in exploration history, and conspiracy theorists whispered of suppressed truths. Yet the most enduring lesson of the Vineland saga isn't about forgery, it's about how maps, real or fake, shape our collective memory. even today, as most scholars dismiss the map as a 20th century hoax, its ghost lingers in textbooks and documentaries. Why? Because every great map is a story, and some stories are too compelling to fade, even under the glare of evidence. The Vineland map's true power wasn't in its ink or parchment, but in its audacious claim that the past might still hold surprises, waiting to redraw the borders of what we think we know. While monks and scholars debated monsters and miracles, a quiet revolution was unfolding in the harbors of Genoa and Venice, one that would turn the map-making world upside down. Portolan charts, those unassuming sheets of vellum crisscrossed with radiating lines, didn't bother with golden cities or biblical landmarks. Their beauty lay in their brutal practicality. Here was a coastline, here a safe harbor, here the distance a ship could travel in a day's steady wind. These were maps stripped of allegory, designed not to inspire or intimidate but to keep sailors alive. And in their ink-stained corners, they carried the seeds of a new worldview, one where experience trumped tradition, and the only dragons that mattered were the storms marked with careful red X's. What made portolan charts so radical wasn't just their accuracy, but their origins. Unlike the Mapamundi crafted by cloistered monks, these maps were born on the decks of ships. Captains traded notes in smoky taverns, swapping details about hidden reefs and tricky currents. Mediterranean pilots etched their knowledge onto wax tablets, later transcribed onto parchment by workshops in Majorca and Barcelona. This was crowd-sourced cartography, centuries before the term existed. The result, a network of room lines, those spiderweb-like routes radiating from compass roses that let sailors plot courses with unprecedented precision. No need for divine guidance when you had a clear path to Alexandria. The clash between portolans and traditional maps wasn't just stylistic, it was philosophical. Church authorities distrusted these secular charts, fearing they encouraged recklessness by making distant lands seem attainable. Scholars scoffed at their lack of classical references. Where were the Pillars of Hercules or the Garden of Eden? But sailors didn't care. When a 14th century Genoese navigator unrolled his portolan, he wasn't looking for salvation. He was calculating how to outrun a squall or find a hidden cove to avoid customs duties. These maps were tools of rebellion, proof that the world could be understood through wind and wave rather than scripture. Yet even portolans couldn't escape the human urge to wonder. Between their stark lines, tiny flourishes crept in: a mermaid near a treacherous cape, a castle icon marking a pirate haunt. Some charts, like the lavish Catalan atlas, blended practical navigation with lingering myths, placing gold-laden kings just beyond the mapped routes. This tension between utility and imagination mirrored the era itself. The Renaissance was dawning, and the old ways wouldn't vanish without a fight. The true triumph of the portolan wasn't in banishing legends, but in proving that two worldviews could coexist. A captain might consult a Mapamundi before mass to ponder God's creation, then unfurl his portolan at dawn to navigate the real world. These maps didn't just guide ships, they charted a middle course between faith and fact, leaving room for both the measurable and the miraculous. And in that balance, they set the stage for the explorers who would soon redraw the globe itself, not with monsters at the edges, but with continents waiting to be claimed. Before the printing press, maps were rare treasures hand-copied on expensive parchment, locked in monastery libraries or royal courts. But when Gutenberg's invention reached cartography in the late 15th century, it sparked a revolution as explosive as any explorer's voyage. Suddenly, maps could be mass-produced, sold in markets, and tucked into the pockets of merchants and students alike. Knowledge of the world wasn't just for kings anymore, it was for anyone with a few coins to spare. Yet this democratization came with a price, a cutthroat battle among publishers to control the narrative of geography itself. Take the case of Abraham Ortelius, the Antwerp mapmaker whose Theatrum Orbis Terrarum became the world's first modern atlas in 1570. His innovation wasn't just in the maps themselves, but in how he marketed them. Each edition boasted the latest discoveries, a phrase that lured buyers hungry for novelty. Rival publishers raced to outdo him, adding speculative coastlines or embellishing rumors of Amazon warrior kingdoms to make their atlases stand out. The printing press didn't just spread maps, it turned them into battlegrounds where accuracy jostled with sensationalism. At the heart of this chaos stood Gerardus Mercator, a figure who bridged medieval mysticism and modern science. His famous 1569 world map introduced the projection that still bears his name, a grid of straight lines that made navigation easier but distorted the size of continents. Critics accused him of heresy for stretching the earth, while sailors hailed him as a genius. The irony, Mercator himself never intended his map for navigation. It was a scholarly tool, crammed with Latin annotations and references to Ptolemy. But once the presses got hold of it, his work took on a life of its own. Pirated editions stripped away his careful text, leaving only the bold lines that would guide empires. The printing press also amplified long-simmering rivalries. In Venice, the rival houses of Ruscelli and Gastaldi dueled with increasingly lavish editions, adding hand-colored illustrations or gilded borders to attract wealthy patrons. In Germany, Sebastian Münster's Cosmographia outsold competitors by mixing maps with lurid tales of cannibals and unicorns, a medieval bestiary repackaged for the Renaissance reader. These weren't just business tactics, they were cultural earthquakes. Every time a printer chose to include or exclude a mythical island, they were voting on what counted as real. And then there were the mistakes, errors magnified by the press's reach. When a Lisbon printer mislabeled California as an island in the 1600s, the error spread like wildfire, appearing in maps for over a century. Correcting it required not just new exploration, but a costly campaign to retract thousands of printed sheets. The printing press gave maps immortality, for better or worse. A monk's doodle of a sea monster might fade into obscurity, but once inked onto copperplate, it could haunt geography textbooks for generations. Yet for all the chaos, this era birthed something extraordinary, the idea that the world could be shared. A farmer in Flanders might now trace the route of Magellan's voyage. A tailor in Paris could ponder the shape of Africa. The rivalries between mapmakers weren't just about profit. They were about who got to define reality for an entire continent of readers. And in that struggle, the modern map was born, no longer a sacred object, but a living thing, endlessly debated, revised, and reimagined. The press didn't just print maps, it printed the future. Gerardus Mercator and Abraham Ortelius stood at a crossroads in the history of cartography, one wielding mathematics like a scalpel, the other stitching together the world's stories with an artist's needle. Their rivalry wasn't just about maps, it was a clash of visions for how humanity should see itself. Mercator, the meticulous Flemish scholar, believed the Earth could be tamed by geometry. His famous projection, published in 1569, transformed the globe into a grid of perfect right angles, where sailors could plot straight-line courses across oceans. But this mathematical elegance came at a cost. Greenland ballooned to the size of Africa, and Antarctica stretched into an endless fringe. For Mercator, distortion was a fair trade. Navigation came first, even if it meant sacrificing the world's true proportions. Ortelius took a different path. His Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, released just a year before Mercator's projection, wasn't a single map but a curated collection, an atlas that celebrated diversity rather than imposing uniformity. Where Mercator's work felt like a mathematician's theorem, Ortelius's pages pulsed with life. He gathered maps from across Europe, preserving their quirks and regional biases, then bound them together with lavish illustrations of sea monsters and galleons. His genius lay in synthesis. He didn't force the world into a single framework but let it speak through many voices. A viewer flipping through his atlas might see Scandinavia drawn 3 different ways, each reflecting the prejudices and knowledge of its maker. The tension between these approaches mirrored the Renaissance itself. Mercator's projection appealed to the era's rising scientific rigor, its lines as crisp as a banker's ledger. But Ortelius understood something deeper, that maps were never just tools, they were cultural artifacts shaped by the fears and fantasies of their creators. His inclusion of the mythical island of Friesland wasn't an error. It was a nod to the sailors' tales that still colored Europe's imagination. Even as he pruned the wildest myths, he left room for wonder, etching dragons into the margins like a sly wink to tradition. Their rivalry pushed cartography forward in unexpected ways. Mercator's obsession with precision led him to coin the term atlas for a collection of maps, yet it was Ortelius who popularized the format. Ortelius's eclectic approach might have seemed old-fashioned, but his insistence on citing sources, a novelty at the time, laid groundwork for modern academic standards. Together, they embodied a paradox. The more accurately maps depicted the world, the more clearly they revealed how much remained unknowable. The legacy of their duel lingers in every digital map we use today. Mercator's projection lives on in navigation apps, warping our screens just as it once warped parchment. But Ortelius's spirit thrives too, in the layers we toggle on and off, the crowd-sourced edits, the way modern apps blend street views with satellite imagery. Their battle wasn't just about lines on paper. It was about whether maps should aspire to perfection or embrace the messy, magnificent diversity of human perception. And 6 centuries later, we're still trying to have it both ways. The legend of El Dorado wasn't born on a map, it was born in a ceremony. High in the Andes, the Muisca people of Colombia practiced a ritual where their leader, coated in gold dust, would plunge into Lake Guatavita as offerings of emeralds and gold figurines sank beneath the waters. When Spanish conquistadors heard fragments of this tradition, their imaginations ignited. What began as a mistranslation, the Golden One, twisted into the Golden City, spiraled into one of history's most tenacious cartographic myths. Within decades, maps of South America bristled with golden towers, often hovering just beyond the edges of explored territory. The irony, many of these maps were drawn by men who'd never set foot in the jungle, their ink fueled by greed, desperation, and the whispers of rivals. Take the infamous map of Walter Raleigh's 1595 expedition, where El Dorado glimmered somewhere near the Orinoco River. Raleigh, a courtier desperate to regain Queen Elizabeth's favor after a scandal, didn't just include the city, he anchored his entire voyage around it. His map, more propaganda than geography, showed rivers lined with gold deposits and indigenous villages eager to trade. Never mind that his own scouts admitted they'd found no such wealth. The map's purpose wasn't to inform, but to lure investors for his next ill-fated journey. This was cartography as crowdfunding, where accuracy mattered less than selling the dream. Yet the myth persisted long after Raleigh's head rolled on the executioner's block. Dutch mapmakers in the 1600s, locked in their own colonial race with Spain, sprinkled El Dorado across Guyana like breadcrumbs. German printers, eager to outsell competitors, added ever more elaborate illustrations, gilded palaces, gem-studded temples, even as explorers like Alexander von Humboldt debunked the legend in the early 1800s. Humboldt, a scientist with little patience for fairy tales, meticulously charted the Orinoco Basin and declared El Dorado a poisonous fantasy. But by then, the Golden City had taken on a life of its own, migrating from maps into poems, operas, and the popular imagination. Why did cartographers cling to a lie? The answer lies in the economics of exploration. Printing a map with blank spaces meant admitting ignorance and, worse, admitting that the next expedition might not pay off. But a map hinting at El Dorado that promised returns, Spanish crown officials, desperate to justify their costly colonies, quietly encouraged the myth. English and Dutch rivals, hungry to undermine Spanish claims, happily exaggerated indigenous tales of gold. Even the church played along, framing the search as a divine mission to rescue heathen wealth for Christian purposes. The line between mapmaker and con artist blurred. Every stroke of the pen could mean another ship funded, another rival outmaneuvered. Not all cartographers succumbed. The Portuguese-Brazilian mapmaker João Teixeira, working in the mid-1600s, deliberately omitted El Dorado from his charts, labeling the Amazon basin with cautious notes about hostile tribes and impassable forests. His sober approach won few admirers at court, but it revealed an alternate tradition, mapmakers who saw their craft as a shield against folly. Similarly, French Jesuit missionaries, though hardly impartial, often corrected gold-laden fantasies with first-hand accounts of malaria and mud. Their maps, duller but more reliable, gathered dust in archives while the glittering lies sailed on. The ghost of El Dorado finally faded not because explorers stopped believing, but because maps stopped needing it. By the 19th century, nationalism and science had reshaped cartography's priorities. Rivers were surveyed for steamships, not gold. Borders were drawn for empires, not treasure hunts. Yet the myth's legacy lingers in our love for lost city stories from Atlantis to Wakanda. El Dorado wasn't just a place, it was a mirror, reflecting back the obsessions of every era that chased it. And in that sense, perhaps the cartographers weren't entirely wrong to keep drawing it. The golden city they sought wasn't on any map. It was the future itself, always shimmering, always just out of reach. Fra Mauri's world map from 1459 is a masterpiece of contradictions, a bridge between medieval mysticism and the dawning age of exploration. At first glance, it looks like a typical medieval Mapamundi, with Jerusalem centered and the Garden of Eden hovering just beyond the Indian Ocean. But zoom in, and the details tell a different story. Fra Mauro, a Camaldolese monk working in Venice, didn't just copy old legends, he cross-examined them. His map is littered with notes like, "I do not include this mountain because no reliable witness has confirmed it," or "Some say the Nile rises here, but others disagree." This wasn't blind faith in tradition. It was cartography as courtroom, where every claim faced scrutiny. What set Fra Mauro apart was his sources. Venice in the 15th century was a whirlwind of trade and gossip, where Arab merchants swapped tales with Jewish scholars and returning crusaders bragged over wine. Fra Mauro soaked it all in, stitching together accounts from Ethiopian diplomats, Persian travelers, and even Chinese maps brought along the Silk Road. His depiction of Africa, for example, shattered centuries of myth. Earlier maps showed the continent tapering sharply south, hemmed in by a boiling ocean. But Fra Mauro's Africa stretched open-ended, its western coast vaguely mirroring reality because he'd listened to Portuguese sailors who'd ventured beyond Cape Bajador. He couldn't resist adding a few marvels like the Mountains of the Moon said to feed the Nile, but even these came with disclaimers. This is what the ancients believed, but modern men doubted. The map's true genius lies in its balance. While Fra Mauro included the classic medieval tropes, Gog and Magog lurking in the north, the Tower of Babel looming over Babylon, he gave them less prominence. Paradise might still perch at the top, but it squeezed into a corner as if embarrassed to take up space. Meanwhile, real-world cities like Tenochtitlan, years before Cortés arrived, appear with surprising accuracy, based on whispers from Maya traders. This delicate dance between the world as it was imagined and the world as it was being discovered made his work irresistible to both scholars and princes. Even King Afonso of Portugal, a man obsessed with hard-nosed navigation, commissioned a copy. Fra Maurice's legacy isn't just in what he drew, but in what he dared to leave out. His map is notably free of the cannibal tribes and one-eyed giants that crowded other works. When he did include wonders like the spice-filled Isle of Women, he labeled them carefully. Some say this island exists, but I have found no proof. That restraint marked a turning point. For the first time, a major cartographer was treating myths as hypotheses rather than facts, leaving room for doubt and discovery. His map wasn't a final answer, but a conversation. And in that conversation, we hear the first murmurs of a new idea, that the world might be bigger, stranger, and more wonderful than either the scholars or the storytellers had dreamed. When Christopher Columbus returned from his first voyage in 1493, he carried not just gold and parrots, but a crisis for Europe's mapmakers. His logs described islands where medieval charts showed only ocean and people where monsters were supposed to be. For the scholars hunched over their parchments, this posed an impossible choice: admit their life's work was wrong or find ways to dismiss the evidence. Some, like the German cosmographer Martin Waldseemüller, embraced the new reality with startling speed. His 1507 world map was the first to label the unexpected landmass as America, a name borrowed from explorer Amerigo Vespucci's reports, slapped onto what we now call Brazil. This wasn't just an update, it was a revolution in ink, declaring that the old certainties could no longer hold. But not everyone surrendered so easily. The Spanish court's official cartographer, Juan de la Cosa, drew his famous world map in 1500 with deliberate ambiguity. The Caribbean islands Columbus discovered float at the map's edge, cramped into a corner as if they might vanish if ignored. More tellingly, he left the Western Ocean blank, no hint of a continental landmass, just empty waves stretching to Asia as Ptolemy had promised. This wasn't ignorance, it was denial. De la Cosa knew the stakes. If these new lands were truly a separate continent, then centuries of church-approved geography and the lucrative trade routes built upon it were obsolete. The backlash took stranger forms in academic circles. Scholars like Pietro Martire d'Anghiera insisted the Caribbean islands were merely outliers of Japan, clinging to Marco Polo's descriptions like life rafts. In universities from Paris to Salamanca, professors debated whether Columbus had actually reached the Indies or just stumbled upon a previously unknown cluster of islands. The resistance wasn't just stubbornness, it was about power. Monastic mapmakers who'd spent decades copying Mapamundi stood to lose their prestige if their sacred geography became irrelevant. Merchants who'd financed expeditions to Asia saw their investments threatened by unexpected competition. Even the church hesitated, wary of admitting that biblical commentaries might need revision based on sailors' tales. Yet the truth kept washing ashore. When Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498, proving Africa could be sailed around, another pillar of medieval geography crumbled. The Indian Ocean wasn't a closed sea as Ptolemy had claimed, but a highway to unimaginable wealth. Mapmakers scrambled to keep up, some literally cutting and pasting, slicing apart old parchments to insert new coastlines. The Portuguese royal cartographer Pedro Rienel took a bolder approach. His 1504 chart of the Indian Ocean ignored tradition entirely. drawing Africa's southern tip with clinical precision and stuffing the margins with practical notes about monsoons and pirate haunts. For the first time, utility trumped orthodoxy. The most fascinating resistance came from the Mythmakers themselves. As explorers peeled back the Atlantic's mysteries, the old legends didn't vanish, they migrated. The Fountain of Youth, once placed in Asia, now lurked in Florida thanks to Ponce de Leon's publicity stunt. The 7 cities of gold leaped from the Sahara to New Mexico. Even Prester John's Christian kingdom got a relocation, bouncing from India to Ethiopia to the Amazon basin as each previous location was debunked. This wasn't just wishful thinking, it was survival. If the monsters and marvels couldn't exist where they'd always been, they'd simply move to the new blank spaces on the map. By 1550, the dam had burst. Gerardus Mercator's globe showed a recognizably modern Earth, with North and South America clearly distinct from Asia, but the scars of the transition remained. In the Pacific, where Magellan's crew had found endless open water, some maps still sketched phantom continents, ghosts of the old certainty that the world must be small enough for quick crossings. The real revelation of the age of exploration wasn't just new lands, but the humbling lesson that followed. No map could ever be final. Each generation's certainties would become the next curiosities, inked over by those brave enough to admit how much they didn't know. John Mandeville's Travels was the medieval equivalent of a blockbuster, a rollicking adventure that promised readers the world, then gleefully made most of it up. Written in the mid-14th century, this wildly popular book claimed to be the first-hand account of an English knight's journeys from Constantinople to the edge of the known world. Mandeville described encounters with headless men whose faces sat on their chests, tribes who worshipped giant ants, and valleys so deep they swallowed sunlight. It was equal parts travel guide, fantasy novel, and theological treatise, and for centuries, even the most skeptical scholars struggled to separate fact from fabrication. What made Mandeville's tales so irresistible wasn't just their audacity, but their veneer of credibility. Unlike pure myths, his stories nestled comfortably alongside real geography. He correctly described the pyramids of Egypt before pivoting to claim they stored Joseph's biblical grain. He noted the spice trade routes of the Indian Ocean, then populated those same waters with islands ruled by dog-headed cannibals. This careful stitching of truth and tall tale gave his work a dangerous plausibility. When cartographers like Fra Mauro or Martin Behaim referenced Mandeville, they weren't being gullible. They were working with the best evidence available in an era when few could verify distant wonders. The real genius or mischief of Mandeville lay in how his fabrications fed rivalries between mapmakers. Take his description of the mythical Christian kingdom of Prester John, supposedly nestled beyond the Muslim world. Some mapmakers, eager to please church patrons, placed it prominently in Ethiopia or India. Others, more skeptical, tucked it into marginal notes or omitted it entirely. These choices weren't neutral. A map that included Prester John's kingdom sent a political message that Christendom had allies in the East waiting to rally against Islam. Rival courts and trading powers seized on different parts of Mandeville's narrative, each cherry-picking details to justify their own expeditions or alliances. Mandeville's influence even shaped exploration itself. Columbus carried a heavily annotated copy of Travels on his voyages, scribbling excited notes in the margins about Mandeville's claims of gold-rich islands. Later, when Spanish conquistadors searched for El Dorado, they weren't just following indigenous rumors, they were chasing shadows from a centuries-old travelogue written by someone who likely never left Europe. The irony, Mandeville himself admitted, buried in his text's labyrinthine passages, that some stories might be diversely told. It was the ultimate medieval disclaimer, a wink to readers that the line between fact and fiction was always negotiable. Yet to dismiss travels as mere fraud misses its deeper cultural role. In an age before encyclopedias or Google Earth, Manville gave ordinary people a way to imagine the world beyond their village. His blending of pilgrimage routes and pure fantasy mirrored how medieval Europeans understood geography, as a tapestry where faith, folklore, and faint traces of real knowledge intertwined. The book's longevity, it remained in print for over 300 years, speaks to a universal truth. Sometimes we don't need maps to be accurate, we need them to be wondrous. And in that, Mandeville's greatest fabrication wasn't the headless men or the ant worshippers. It was the idea that the world could still surprise us. The Kunstmann Roman II map doesn't just chart coastlines, it whispers secrets. Created in the early 16th century, this enigmatic Portuguese portolan hides more than it reveals, its precise lines and cryptic annotations sparking debates that still rage today. At first glance, it's a masterpiece of Renaissance cartography, detailing the African coastline with startling accuracy. But look closer, and the map bristles with oddities. Phantom islands tucked between real ones, strange symbols clustered near trade routes, and a suspiciously blank patch where Brazil should be. This wasn't carelessness. In an era when maps were state secrets, every omission and embellishment carried weight. The Kunstmann Roman II wasn't just a navigational tool, it was a chess move in the cutthroat game of empire. Portugal guarded its maritime knowledge like dragon's gold. After Vasco da Gama's voyage to India in 1498, the Crown imposed draconian laws. Any sailor caught sharing maps with foreigners faced execution. The Kunstmann Roman II, likely smuggled out of Lisbon by a disgruntled cartographer, became a Rosetta Stone for rival powers. Spanish spies pored over its details, searching for weaknesses in Portugal's African strongholds. Venetian merchants decoded its symbols, hoping to undercut Portuguese spice monopolies. Even the Ottomans, locked in a naval Cold War with Christendom, coveted its clues. The map's true power lay in what it didn't show, that blank space off South America, a deliberate smokescreen. Portugal had already stumbled upon Brazil in 1500 but kept it quiet to avoid sharing the bounty. The Kunstmann Roman II silence wasn't ignorance, it was strategy. Yet the map's mysteries go deeper than politics. Its margins crawl with cryptic annotations in a mix of Latin, Arabic, and cipher-like symbols. One note near the Cape of Good Hope warns of the serpent's breath, possibly a reference to treacherous winds or something darker. Another, scrawled beside an unmarked island in the Atlantic, claims here lies the mirror. Scholars still debate whether this refers to a lost navigational trick, a hoax to lure rivals into dead ends, or even a veiled reference to the mythical island of Antalya. The Kunstmann Roman II thrives on this ambiguity, its secrets layered like an onion. The backlash was inevitable. When a copy reached the German cartographer Martin Waldseemüller, he accused the Portuguese of drawing lies in ink. His own maps, based on second-hand accounts, boldly filled in the blanks the Kunstmann Roman II left empty, sometimes correctly, often spectacularly wrong. This tension between secrecy and speculation defined the age. Every hidden reef on a Portuguese map spawned a dozen phantom islands on Dutch or English copies, as cartographers turned guesswork into propaganda. The Kunstmann Roman II didn't just reflect the world, it warped it, proving that a map's greatest power wasn't in revealing reality, but in shaping what people believed was possible. Today, the map's legacy lingers in plain sight. Modern satellite imagery has debunked its omissions, yet its tactics endure. Governments still classify sensitive geography. Corporations hide mineral deposits on public maps, and fantasy cartographers play with blank spaces just as the Kunstmann Roman II creators did. The difference: we've traded ciphers for copyrights and royal decrees for algorithms, but the game remains the same. Whoever controls the map controls the dream of what lies beyond it. By the mid-16th century, something curious began happening to the monsters on maps. They started disappearing. Not in a grand vanishing act, but slowly, like shadows retreating at dawn. The shift wasn't just about better geography. It mirrored a tectonic change in how Europe saw itself. As printing presses multiplied and explorers' logs piled up, the unknown became measurable rather than mystical. Take the case of Gerardus Mercator's 1569 world map. His projection revolutionized navigation with its mathematical precision. But look closely at the oceans. The sea serpents are smaller, tucked into corners as if embarrassed. Compare this to the Carta Marina of 1539, where monsters dominated whole swaths of water, and the difference is stark. This wasn't merely artistic preference, it was a quiet surrender. The age when maps could freely mix fact and fantasy was ending. The reasons were as practical as they were philosophical. With colonies and trade routes now global chess pieces, accuracy meant money. A Spanish merchant planning a voyage to Manila needed reliable currents, not mermaids. Dutch East India Company captains demanded charts where spice islands weren't obscured by drawings of gold-laden kings. Even the church, long the patron of sacred geography, began prioritizing missionary logistics over symbolism. When Jesuit mapmakers like Matteo Ricci brought Western cartography to Ming China in the 1580s, their maps showcased latitude lines and continent shapes, not the Garden of Eden. The stakes were too high for poetry, yet the real death knell for mythical maps came from an unexpected quarter: insurance. As maritime trade boomed, underwriters in London and Amsterdam refused to cover ships relying on fanciful charts. A 1592 lawsuit in Lisbon reveals the turning point. A widow sued a mapmaker after her husband's ship wrecked near a reef his decorative sea monster had obscured. The court ruled in her favor, setting a precedent that echoed through guild halls. Suddenly, cartographers faced liability for their dragons, but the decline wasn't total. Myth simply migrated to the margins. Dutch atlases of the 1600s, while ruthlessly accurate in their main maps, often included inset illustrations of marvels from distant lands, a subtle nod to popular demand. Even Captain Cook's meticulously surveyed Pacific charts occasionally noted indigenous tales of underwater cities, albeit with skeptical footnotes. The difference: these were now clearly marked as stories, not geography. The map had finally drawn its own most important line, the one between knowledge and legend. What faded wasn't wonder itself, but the privilege of passing off imagination as truth. And in that shift lay the birth of the modern map, not as a canvas for dreams, but as a mirror of the world as we dared to measure it. Legends have a way of clinging to maps long after their expiration date, like stubborn stains on parchment. No myth illustrates this better than the kingdom of Prester John, a shimmering mirage that danced at the edges of European maps for over 500 years. The story began in 1265 with a letter supposedly from this Christian king, ruling a paradise beyond the Islamic world, his throne carved from a single emerald, his armies ready to aid Christendom. Never mind that no one could trace the letter's origin, or that every expedition to find him returned empty-handed. The idea was too seductive to abandon. Here was hope inked onto vellum, proof that beyond the reach of Muslim caliphates, a righteous ally awaited. What's fascinating isn't just how long Prester John endured, but how he evolved. When Mongol invasions shattered the illusion of his Asian kingdom, mapmakers simply relocated him to Ethiopia. Venetian cartographers like Fra Mauro tucked his realm into East Africa, citing shadowy reports from Coptic monks. Portuguese explorers, desperate to justify their voyages down the African coast, insisted his descendants ruled in the highlands even after diplomats met the actual Ethiopian emperor and found no trace of emerald thrones. The myth didn't just survive evidence, it metabolized it, twisting every new discovery into confirmation. The secret to Prester John's longevity lay in his utility. For crusaders, he was a potential ally against Islam. For merchants, he represented untapped markets. For the church, he symbolized global Christianity's reach. And for mapmakers, he was the perfect filler, a dignified way to label blank spaces without resorting to dragons. When the age of exploration finally punctured the myth in the 1600s, it didn't vanish. It just shapeshifted again, merging with rumors of El Dorado or the seven cities of Cibola. Other legends displayed similar stubbornness. The island of High Brassel, said to materialize off Ireland's coast once every 7 years, clung to maps until the 1800s, long after navigational tools could have disproved it. The Zeno brothers' fraudulent 14th century map of the North Atlantic, complete with phantom islands like Friesland, was still being copied by serious cartographers 3 centuries later. Even St. Brendan's mythical island, born from a 6th century monk's voyage tale, got a reprieve when explorers mistook the Azores or Canaries for his promised land. Why did these stories outlast their welcome? Partly because maps weren't just records, they were sales pitches. A chart hinting at Prester John's wealth could secure royal patronage for an expedition. A mermaid sketched near uncharted waters might lure investors dreaming of undiscovered trade routes. But deeper still, these myths fed a human need for the world to feel enchanted. The blank spaces on maps weren't just voids, they were canvases for collective longing. When science finally emptied the oceans of monsters, we filled them with UFOs and Bermuda Triangles. The names change, but the game remains the same. The unknown will always wear the faces of our fears and fantasies. Perhaps the most telling postscript belongs to the Herford Mapamundi. In its margins, amid the one-eyed men and fire-breathing salamanders, a tiny figure of Prester John still kneels in prayer. The map's modern curators considered restoring this detail during conservation, not as history, but as a testament to how powerfully stories can shape our vision of the world. After all, we no longer believe in his kingdom, but we've never stopped searching for our own versions of it: hidden valleys, lost cities, planets that might harbor life. The medieval mapmakers understood something we're only now relearning, that facts might guide us, but it's the legends that move us. A map hanging in a royal court wasn't just a tool, it was a weapon. In an age when few could read and even fewer had seen the world, cartographers held immense power to shape perceptions, and rulers knew it. Take the case of King Louis XIV of France, who commissioned a series of maps in the 1600s that stretched his kingdom's borders ever so slightly beyond reality. Rivers inched wider, neighboring territories appeared smaller, and disputed lands were shaded firmly in French blue. These weren't mistakes, they were deliberate acts of cartographic theater, designed to project dominance to visiting diplomats. The message was clear: France was not just powerful, but inevitable. Religious leaders wielded maps with equal cunning. The Vatican's official cartographers in the 1500s consistently depicted Protestant regions as distorted or fragmented, while Catholic strongholds glowed with meticulous detail. One infamous map from 1584 showed the German states, then a hotbed of reformation, as a chaotic jumble of jagged borders, while Italy basked in harmonious symmetry. These visual slights weren't subtle, they were propaganda masquerading as geography, reinforcing the Church's narrative of heresy breeding disorder. For the cartographers caught in the middle, these demands created impossible choices. The Flemish mapmaker Gerard de Jode, working under Spanish Habsburg rule, faced constant pressure to exaggerate the reach of Catholic territories. When he resisted, his printing privileges mysteriously vanished. Others found creative workarounds, like the anonymous Venetian who labeled a controversial stretch of Balkan coastline with tiny, ambiguous script, knowing most viewers would overlook it. Some paid dearly for their integrity. The Portuguese cartographer Diego Homem was exiled after refusing to erase a rival kingdom's islands from a royal atlas, while Ottoman mapmakers risked execution if their work understated the Sultan's domains. The ethical tightrope only grew more precarious as maps became tools of empire. Spanish charts of the Americas routinely shrunk indigenous settlements to dots while inflating colonial cities into grand metropolises. British maps of India in the 1700s erased entire villages to justify land seizures, labeling them as uninhabited wastelands. These weren't neutral documents, they were blueprints for conquest, drafted in ink and justified by geography. Yet the most insidious propaganda often lay in what maps omitted. Russian Tsars ordered vast stretches of Siberia left blank on official maps, hiding lucrative fur trails from competitors. Dutch merchants deleted islands from shared navigational charts to safeguard spice routes. Even scientific maps of the Enlightenment weren't immune. Thomas Jefferson's surveyors famously minimized the ruggedness of the American West to lure settlers, smoothing mountains into gentle hills. What makes these distortions so chilling isn't just their scale, but their lingering effects. Centuries later, borders drawn to flatter kings still spark modern conflicts, and myths etched onto parchment shape national identities. The real lesson of these maps isn't about geography, it's about how easily lines on paper can become lines in the sand, and how those who control the map don't just describe the world. They define it. The ink may have dried on those medieval parchments, but the fingerprints of those ancient rivalries still smudge every digital map we swipe today. Think about the last fantasy novel you read. The one with the ornate map sprawled across its opening pages, complete with haunted forests and lost citadels. That aesthetic didn't spring from nowhere. It's the direct descendant of those medieval mapmakers who wove dragons into blank spaces. Game of Thrones Westeros, Tolkien's Middle-earth, they all borrow the visual language of the Herford Mapamundi, where every untamed wilderness hinted at adventure. Even the phrase, "here be dragons," has outlived its nautical origins, becoming shorthand for the unknown in everything from video games to corporate risk assessments. But the legacy runs deeper than aesthetics. Those medieval battles between sacred and secular geography birthed the very idea of a canonical map, a single authoritative version of reality. Fast forward to modern geopolitics, and you'll see the same struggles playing out. China's 9-dash line in the South China Sea, India and Pakistan's contested borders in Kashmir. These aren't just disputes over territory. They're clashes over whose narrative gets etched onto the world's mental map, echoing the medieval church's insistence on Jerusalem as Axis Mundi. Even Google Earth isn't neutral. It subtly reinforces certain perspectives based on whose data it prioritizes, much like how Venetian traders once skewed maps to favor their trade routes. The misinformation parallel is uncanny. Medieval mapmakers who sprinkled gold cities across uncharted regions weren't so different from modern algorithms that amplify sensational claims. Both exploit the human craving for wonder and certainty, dressing speculation as fact. When a 14th century monk labeled Africa as the land of men with mouths in their chests, he was working with the best data available garbled traveler accounts, much like how viral social media posts today remix fragments of truth. The difference: today's myths spread at the speed of light, but the psychology remains unchanged. We still prefer a compelling falsehood to an empty space. Yet there's hope in how we've evolved. Modern open-source projects like OpenStreetMap, where volunteers collaboratively chart everything from bike paths to refugee camps, are the spiritual heirs to those medieval portolan charts built from sailors' collective wisdom. The key innovation: transparency. Unlike the Kunstmann Roman II map state secrets, every edit in these platforms is traceable, turning cartography from a weapon of control into a tool of empowerment. It's a quiet triumph over those old rivalries, proof that maps can unite rather than divide, provided we remember their most enduring lesson. Every line we draw is a choice, and every choice tells a story far older than the parchment it's written on. Open any modern fantasy novel or load up a role-playing game, and you'll find yourself staring at a descendant of those medieval maps where dragons coil around mountain ranges and forgotten ruins dot the edges of the known world. The tradition of blending geography with legend didn't vanish when sea monsters faded from nautical charts. It simply migrated, finding new life in the pages of Tolkien, the pixels of Skyrim, and the lore of Dungeons and Dragons. Today's fantasy cartographers are the spiritual heirs of those medieval monks and Arab scholars, still locked in the same eternal tug of war. How much should a map explain, and how much should it leave to wonder? Take J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth maps, meticulously drafted with the precision of a scholar who spent years studying Anglo-Saxon chronicles. His coastlines curve with plausible erosion patterns. His mountain ranges follow geological logic, yet lurking in the margins are hints of the unexplained. The "here be dragons" of his world isn't a label but an absence. The vast, uncharted lands east of Rhûn, or the blank spaces south of Harad, where only cryptic notes like the Darklands hint at untold stories. Tolkien, a medievalist by training, understood the power of omission. His maps feel real precisely because they don't show everything, echoing the Herford Mapamundi's balance of fact and mystery. Game designers have taken this even further. The Elder Scrolls series embeds its lore directly into its landscapes, where every crumbling tower and buried dungeon teases a larger history. When players unroll Skyrim's in-game map, they're not just navigating, they're inheriting a tradition that dates back to those medieval cartographers who tucked biblical scenes between real rivers. The difference: modern tools allow for layers of interaction. Click on a fortress in the Witcher 3 map, and you might trigger a flashback. Hover over a village in Divinity, Original Sin, and its tragic backstory unfolds. These aren't just waypoints, they're portals to story, much like how Fra Moro's annotations turned geography into theology. Yet the rivalry between accuracy and imagination persists. Compare the ruthlessly practical maps in George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, where distances matter for troop movements and supply lines, to the dreamlike, symbolic charts in Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea novels, where islands shift slightly between printings to reflect the archipelago's magical instability. Martin's approach mirrors the portolan charts of Genos merchants, all business and strategy. Le Guin's, meanwhile, channels the medieval Mapamundi, where a place's emotional weight matters more than its coordinates. Both are valid, both are beloved, and their tension echoes the same debates that once raged between Al Idris's grids and the Hereford Mapamundi's wonders. Even the empty spaces on modern fantasy maps serve the same psychological purpose as those medieval sea monsters. From the unknown regions in Star Wars to the terra incognita of tabletop RPGs, these blanks invite players and readers to project their own stories onto them, just as 15th century sailors imagined gold cities beyond the horizon. The critical shift: today's creators often weaponize those blanks. In games like Elden Ring, uncharted areas aren't just undefined, they're deliberately eerie, withholding threats until players stumble upon them. It's a technique straight from the Kunstmann Roman 2 Maps playbook. What you don't see is far more terrifying than what you do. The most fascinating evolution lies in collaborative world building. Platforms like World Anvil or Incarnate let thousands of amateur cartographers craft their own realms, sharing them in online bazaars that rival the medieval scriptoriums where maps were copied and embellished. The difference: now, a teenager in Jakarta can riff on a stranger's mountain range from Oslo, adding dragon lairs or lost temples in real time. It's the democratization of a process once reserved for kings and popes, and the myths being woven are no less vivid for their digital ink. What medieval mapmakers would recognize instantly, though, is the enduring hunger for enchantment. GPS can guide us to the nearest coffee shop, but we still crave maps where the coffee shop might secretly be a fairy portal. The dragons have migrated from parchment to pixels, but their job remains the same: to remind us that the world, real or imagined, is always wider and stranger than the edges of our charts. And perhaps that's the most timeless rivalry of all, not between accuracy and imagination, but between the need to know where we are and the hope that we might still be surprised by what lies beyond the next hill. Those medieval mapmakers and mythmakers left behind more than just crumbling parchment. They left a masterclass in storytelling that still resonates today. Whether you're crafting a fantasy novel, designing a video game world, or even shaping historical narratives, their struggles with fact and fiction offer surprising lessons. The first is the power of strategic ambiguity. Just as Fra Mauro labeled certain wonders unverified, rather than omitting them entirely, modern storytellers can leave room for mystery without sacrificing credibility. Think of how Susan Collins' Hunger Games maps of Panem deliberately leave entire districts vague, or how the Mandalorian Star Wars galaxy constantly hints at uncharted regions. These blank spaces aren't failures of imagination, they're invitations, mirroring the medieval practice of letting viewers' minds fill the gaps. But with that power comes responsibility. Medieval cartographers who exaggerated El Dorado's riches or downplayed dangerous reefs weren't just telling tales, they were steering lives. Today's creators face similar ethical choices. Historical fiction authors, for instance, must balance dramatic license with honoring real struggles. When The Crown dramatizes royal conversations, or when Assassin's Creed blends real events with sci-fi, they're walking the same tightrope as those Renaissance mapmakers who tweaked coastlines to please patrons. The key lesson: transparency. Just as the best medieval maps distinguished between "here be dragons" and "here be trade routes," modern storytellers can signal where they've diverged from fact through authors' notes, in-game codexes, or framing devices like unreliable narrators. The most enduring maps thrived on layered storytelling. The Herford Mapamundi worked simultaneously as a spiritual guide, a travel reference, and a cultural scrapbook. Similarly, the best world-building today operates on multiple levels. Consider the Witcher series, where a casual player might enjoy the monster hunts, while lore enthusiasts uncover layers of Slavic mythology and political allegory. This medieval approach, embedding depth beneath accessibility, creates universes that feel lived in rather than staged. Yet the maps also warn against over-explanation. Modern franchises often exhaustively catalog every detail of their worlds, leaving no room for audience imagination. Contrast this with Hayao Miyazaki's films, where mysterious spirits and half-glimpsed kingdoms evoke the same wonder as those medieval margins full of dog-headed men. Sometimes the most compelling stories are the ones that resist full disclosure, trusting viewers to meet them halfway. just as sailors once pored over sea monsters and saw both warnings and possibilities in the same ink strokes. Perhaps the deepest lesson lies in humility. The mapmakers who clung to myths like Prester John weren't just stubborn, they were human, reluctant to surrender narratives that gave meaning to chaos. Today's storytellers grapple with the same tension between cherished tropes and evolving truths. The solution: embrace the medieval mindset of the map as a living document, always ready to be redrawn. After all, the greatest stories, like the greatest maps, aren't in points. They're conversations across time, where each generation adds its own lines to the parchment, knowing full well that the next might erase them in pursuit of something truer or stranger or more beautiful. Digital maps have transformed from static snapshots into living, breathing worlds, yet the age-old tug of war between fact and fantasy hasn't disappeared. It's simply upgraded its tools. Modern platforms like Google Earth can zoom down to your rooftop with satellite precision, but switch to Wikipedia mode, and suddenly those same streets pulse with user-generated pins marking everything from alien sightings to local Bigfoot lore. This isn't just technological progress, it's the medieval mapmaker's dilemma reborn in pixels. The Krakens and Golden Cities didn't vanish. They migrated to Reddit threads and augmented reality games, where crowdsourced myths dance atop algorithmic geography. Take Pokémon Go as a case study. When players chase virtual creatures through real-world parks, they're enacting a ritual older than Mercator's globe, layering imagination onto physical space. Niantic's map isn't neutral, it highlights sponsored locations like Starbucks while leaving rural areas barren, much like how Renaissance cartographers exaggerated wealthy trade ports. Even the game's rarest Pokémon spawn near landmarks, subtly teaching players to see their cities through a mythic lens. The result: a generation that navigates by both GPS coordinates and the thrill of discovering a Dragonite in a grocery store parking lot. Meanwhile, open-source projects like OpenStreetMap have turned cartography into a battleground of competing truths. During the 2020 Beirut explosion, volunteers raced to update maps with crisis shelters, while others inserted politicized labels about the blast's cause. The parallels to medieval monks arguing over Eden's location are uncanny, except now the debates unfold in real time, with edit histories replacing parchment marginalia. Even Google Maps isn't immune. Type UFO sightings into the search bar, and you'll find thousands of user tags plotting close encounters alongside gas stations and coffee shops. The digital age hasn't erased mythical thinking, it's given it geotags. The implications for future mapmaking are staggering. Augmented reality headsets like Apple's Vision Pro promise to overlay personalized legends onto reality. One user might see historical battle markers, while another sees fantasy quest markers. Already, apps like Atlas Obscura crowdsource hidden wonders, from haunted alleys to glowworm caves, creating alternate maps for the curious. These platforms don't just document the world, they fracture it into infinite subjective versions, each reflecting its creator's biases and dreams. The Herford Mapamundi's blend of faith and geography seems almost quaint compared to a future where every pedestrian walks through a bespoke mythscape. Yet the darkest twist lies in how easily these tools can weaponize nostalgia. When fantasy cartographers design fictional nationalist histories for games like Crusader Kings, or when authoritarian regimes subtly adjust digital borders, they're wielding the same power as those Renaissance mapmakers who stretched their king's domains. The stakes are higher now. A single algorithm tweak can erase villages from global consciousness, much like how Portuguese charts once hid Brazil. The irony. For all our satellites and AI, we still crave the magic those medieval scribes baked into their parchments. The most popular digital maps today aren't the most accurate, they're the ones with the best stories. Strava's heat maps reveal secret running trails through urban labyrinths. Geocaching turns suburban sidewalks into treasure hunts. Even NASA Mars maps now include whimsical features like Pirate's Cove and Cyanum Fossae, proving that no matter how precise our tools become, we'll always reserve margins for monsters. The great rivalry never ended, it just learned to code. So here's a question for you. When you unroll a map, what are you hoping to find? A flawless grid of streets and borders, or a world where the edges blur into legend? Think about the last time you got lost in a fantasy novel's map, tracing your finger along the dotted lines of dwarven tunnels or the inked shadows of enchanted forests. Now picture your GPS ruthlessly efficient, slicing the world into coordinates. Which one feels more alive? This isn't just about taste, it's about what maps are for. The medieval monks who sketched sea serpents onto their charts weren't delusional, they were acknowledging the limits of human knowledge. A blank space wasn't empty, it was a question. Today, we've swapped monsters for metadata, but the tension remains. Google Maps can guide you to a coffee shop, but can it tell you about the ghost stories whispered in its basement? The best maps, whether drawn on parchment or pixels, do both. They anchor us in reality while leaving room for the unexplainable. Consider how you navigate your own life. Do you crave the certainty of a step-by-step itinerary, or do you leave margins for detours and daydreams? There's a reason fantasy maps endure. They tap into something primal, the same itch that made explorers pore over Ptolemy's errors or sailors chase mirages of golden cities. Accuracy has its place, but so does wonder. After all, the first person to label a mountain, "Here be dragons," wasn't lying, they were confessing how much they didn't know. So toss your answer into the comments below. Do you side with the Mythmakers, stitching legends into latitude lines, or the surveyors, ruthlessly erasing anything that can't be measured? And here's the real challenge. Can you imagine a map that does both? Because somewhere between GPS pins and inked krakens, we're still drawing the same human story, one where the journey matters as much as the destination, and the best maps always leave a little room for magic.